Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 178th New Social Environment. I'm Anya Bernstein, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between October Guest Critic Amanda Gluibizzi and artists Laura Lisbon, Suzanne Silver, and Squeak Cornwath to discuss the October Guest Critic Page on Edges. The conversation will be led by Rail Managing Editor Charles Schultz. We're also thrilled to have the poet Steve Benson here, who will read to close today's program. So to begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail recognizes the illegal annexation of the Republic of Artsakh as a grave international injustice. We stand in support of the Armenian people and the global Armenian diaspora. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. So before I introduce our guests and hosts, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's guests. Laura Lisbon is a painter and chair of the Department of Art at Ohio State University. Exhibitions include a large-scale project for, excuse my pronunciation, Le Paradoxe du Dauphin et d'Humeur in Amélie, France. Her most recent setup was exhibited in Gray Matters at the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2017. With Philip Armstrong and Stephen Melville, she co-curated and co-wrote the catalog for the exhibition As Painting, Division and Displacement, held at Wexner Center in 2001. Suzanne Silver is an artist living and working in Columbus, Ohio, where she is Associate Professor of Art at The Ohio State University. Silver has exhibited her work internationally. Her work is in the collection of the Centre Pompidou in Paris and the Jewish Museum in New York City. Squeak Cornwath is an artist and dedicated Trump resistor who lives and works in Oakland, California. She is Professor Emerita at UC Berkeley and has been awarded 2 individual artist fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Lee Krasner Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pollock Krasner Foundation. In 2019, she was inducted into the National Academy of Design and Art. Squeak's work is currently featured in an online group exhibition, To Hear, Be Heard, curated by Marian McGrath. Her work is also included in Taking Space, Contemporary Women Artists and the Politics of Scale, a show curated by Jody Throckmorton and Brittany Webb at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. Amanda Gluibizzi is an art editor at The Rail. An art historian, she is the co-director of the New Foundation for Art History. Her forthcoming book, Art and Design in 1960s New York, will be out at the end of the year, so you can put it on your holiday gift list now. And our esteemed host, Charles Schultz, is the managing editor of the Brooklyn Rail. So without further ado, Charlie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Anya. And thank you, Amanda, Squeak, Laura, and Suzanne for joining us today. It's a really a wonderful opportunity to kind of take what was made in the pages and bring it into a new medium. So I'm very excited to kind of open up all the things that were in the pages of October. And to start that, I would love to hear from Amanda, whose page it was and who has spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about the edges of paintings. But I'd really like to get to the origin of that. So Amanda, could you kind of give us an origin story of how the edges of paintings became a fascination for you?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for participating. when you talk about edges of paintings to artists, they're like, oh yeah, of course, I always talk about edges. I always look at the edges. You know, the edges are so clearly there, you know. But as art historians, we don't really talk about the edges of paintings. When I started thinking about this project, I was actually in a studio visit with Maya Mietanen, who was one of the other contributors to this page. And she had been painting the edges of her canvases. And so I was saying like, oh, that's so interesting. I always love looking at the edges of paintings. And she was like, I do too. And I said, yeah, you know, it's so funny. I'm sure there's tons of writing about that. And she was, of course, in the process of writing her MFA thesis. And she was like, no, there's nothing about this at all. And I was like, that can't be true. And yet she was totally right. It is in fact true. Very, very few art historians consider the edges of paintings. And there are good reasons for this. Paintings are, according to Alberti and others, windows into another world, right? And so if you acknowledge their limits, then you're acknowledging the fact that that world has limits and that the painting itself exists as a thing as opposed to an image. And so there are really, really good reasons for not looking at the sides of canvases. But at the same time, I think there are really good reasons for looking at the sides of canvases. Obviously, artists do it because they want to know how other people made their work, right? They're making work themselves, and so they want to see what decisions other people are making. For art historians, and particularly art historians like me who don't make work, those are really, really important because it's how I'm trying to figure out how these things were also developed. Particularly if you're writing about artists who are deceased, you can't ask them how they work their paintings up. And so the edges of their canvases are really, really good places for that. And then also, they just tell you stuff about the paintings. Do you mind if I ask Lewis for a slide?
Do it.
Okay. Lewis, I'm looking at like the Rothko, which is on like 31.
That's awesome, Amanda.
So this is a Mark Rothko. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And these images are kind of bad. The left-hand one I just pulled from the web and the right-hand one is taken from my phone. So that's why it's such a crappy image. But one of the things that Rothko did with these works is he left the edges of the canvases painted. And they're actually painted a slightly different tint from the ground or the field on the face of the canvas. And that happens throughout these paintings. So this isn't just this one painting. This happens again and again and again with Rothko. And so that had to have been a decision on his part, right? There is a reason for this moment. For me, I suspect that it's kind of that he's tethering you in place. And so you're kind of like floating in front of this kind of this amorphous cloud rectangle. And the edges kind of like usher you in and kind of hold you there. They tether you there. The next image, the one following, this also is really interesting. This is Laura Owens. This is an untitled piece that's now at the LA County Museum of Art. And like with so many Laura Owenses, there are these really subtle drop shadows in this image, which is kind of abstract and kind of not. And so you can see them particularly down at the bottom. These figures at the bottom are casting these shadows. If you were just to look at the face of this canvas, you would just think like, okay, this is just Laura Owens being Laura Owens, or you would think that this is a random decision or something like that. But if you move to the left-hand side of this canvas, and here again, this image is my image from my phone, there's this really, really bright stripe of highlighter yellow-green right at this point on the side of the canvas that would actually act as the light source for those drop shadows. Now, I have no idea if this is deliberate or not, but this is the sort of stuff that art historians go nuts for. And so then when you start looking at the edges of canvas, they kind of pay you back.
Squeak, that's something that that I remember from your piece also, talking about the edges as a place where you can kind of make observations about the artist's process. And I would suspect, being a painter yourself, rather than Amanda, who's an art historian, that you might see different things when you look at canvases. Can you tell us about what sort of things you look for or you see when you look at the edges of other painters?
Sure. I always look at the edges because I want to see if there's any DNA fingerprints and that the artist actually made it and stuff like that. And also to see like the thickness of the paint and just any leftover studio information. And that's why I like to not frame mine. And then the other thing is that I started putting the titles on the edge for a pragmatic reason, because it's easier to find in the racks when I go look for something, yeah, like that. And so, so it's pragmatic, but also it helps me to, I don't have to go look at a little label, and it's big and it's easy to read. And it's also, when I was talking to Amanda, we had a great interview, and the thing that I came to realize is, yeah, it is like a little fence, and you open the gate and then you go to the painting. And the other thing is, I think of painting as not a real thing, although I think it occupies a real place in our heads, in our brains. I think of it as a thin film of dirt or, pigment materials, anything that you can stick on a flat surface, I guess. And that's a material that's like a powder or something. But that it's, but it's not just that. It's like, if there's a still life, we believe all those, the apple is real, the cup is real, the plate, all that stuff. And that's what I love about painting, is that it's, I think it's a philosophical enterprise. So I love that about it.
Yeah, and I love the idea that that's the bits of the philosophy remain on the edges, almost like maybe a writer's notes or something like this. It's not going to ever be as polished as the surface that we present, but it is always going to, for better or worse, unless we disguise it, it's going to retain the marks of our thoughts and our process. To that end, Louis, I wonder if you could flip forward to a couple images of Suzanne's, because Suzanne's work is really fascinating to look at in conjunction with Squeak's. Suzanne works on vinyl. So there's this whole other element to the idea of the edge. Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, Suzanne, could you speak a little bit to what you have happening along the lower quadrant of your piece here?
Yeah, this is called silent projection, and the strip is like a margin, or I think of my work more, I mean, I must admit I'm a sort of a painter without paint, although I am for once using paint here, but not on a traditional canvas. So I'm interested in illuminated manuscripts and those bands of information, and the multiple framing devices when you think of Mogul miniatures or the Lindisfarne Gospels, where there's this geometric orientation. I'm giving information on the lower band, and then the other edges, because it's clear vinyl and it's thin, although there are several layers, they're collaged on there. That strip is collaged. There's a disappearing act. There's sort of like the ghost space that could disappear into the wall, but the bottom is a margin, and it has information that may reoccur elsewhere in the work. But this idea of the Oriental rug, also the carpet page, the illuminated manuscript, all these references are important to me, as well as the margin, as in drawing, or as in rather writing in a book, and something annotated. And I think this has come up before. One other thing about the Turkish carpet or the Oriental rug, it's it's geometry, it's repeated, so there's certain recursivity involved. I also think of other artists who have been inspired by them, or composers like the composer Morton Feldman, who could compose of 8-9 hours in duration, but influenced by the geometry of the Persian rugs he collected and the repeated patterning. And in his case, it unfolds over a long period of time, but there are these there's repetition and there's difference. There are imperfections, and it's played out on a long, over a long period of time. But just, it's fascinating to me that people in other art forms are influenced by the carpet page, whether it's the illuminated manuscript or the actual Oriental Turkish carpet or Persian rug.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me how many frames are in one of these compositions. You know, when I look at this piece just here, you know, even the individual components of the different images along the bottom edge, they each seem complete in and of themselves, the way I imagine scenes in an illustrated manuscript. I mean, as I know, you know, each scene communicates a certain aspect of the story, and so there are many elements that connect to one another, that need one another almost in order for a sense of meaning to really pass to the viewer. When you are organizing a composition like this, how forward are you thinking about your edges, and how much of it is coming to you in the process of because I'm thinking about Squeak here, and I'm thinking if I tried to look at the edges here, I don't know what it would give me.
No, my work is very much process oriented, and I loved hearing what Squeak said. And by the way, I love that image of the storage unit, because it's like going to the library. You know, you see the spines of the books, and
That's such a good comparison. I like that.
Pull them out and read them, or at least look at the pictures. You know, so yeah, it's process oriented, and but I'm cognizant of vinyl as a material and its transparent or translucent nature. So some of it is, you know, I have basic ideas, like, you know, briefly with silent projection, there are ideas of projection and light and sound. And those little capsule narratives at the bottom do refer to the sound or the suppression of sound, their speech and things like that. So, but it's collaged. So I may have one layer, but then I'll take pieces from another, or I'll make new pieces I think will work, or kind of scavenge earlier work with this is spray or ink or house paint and marker on vinyl.
I like what you're saying about process, and it actually makes me think a lot about the work that Laura's making. Louis, if you wouldn't mind flipping to Laura's work, one of the things that really caught my attention in Laura's contribution to the critics page was that Laura brought up this idea of the temporal edge. And this idea of the edge of the experience of an object. And Louis, if you could kind of flip through, because Laura gave us a good selection that we could see from different sides. Yeah, just keep on flipping, and then maybe, yeah, keep going. And I feel like there's a connection here between the way Laura is using various objects and ideas to really draw attention to this sort of temporal edge, and what you're talking about, Suzanne, with this, with the process orientation, you know, and how one moves from a decision to a decision. So Laura, do you think you could talk to us a little bit about this concept of the temporal edge?
Sure. I think it's a concept question, really. You know, if when I think about the edge, and I've been thinking about them ever since I think they're what paintings are kind of made of, in a way. But I think, you know, often spatially about them, and maybe we think about really the edge of the painting itself, but I wanted to think about the edge instead being brought into the interior of the painting, and not only that, shift to a register of time. So because distinction, like you were saying, that the decision that one makes about the edge, right, that a decision is a kind of distinction. For me, it's a kind of cut, quite, I think decision actually etymologically is about cutting. And so it really, I say it's a question because it's an ongoing question for me. And the way I make paintings is with still for many years now with spraying paint. So there's inside of that process, there's a kind of speed always. There's a kind of interference and interruption to the time that the paint actually hits the surface. And so these object things, these cardboard things that get in the way of that, bring, I think of them as the kind of setups or apparatuses, bring the edge inside the painting and also interrupt the time of the painting. And then the question for me becomes, what am I showing in actually, whether it's the setup or the painting? So, and the setups tend to happen before the painting, but then when I show the setup, I'm showing, you know, it's sort of out of order there. I'm showing the before. So the temporality, I just keep reminding myself, I don't know whether it's a kind of Western art historical thing to think so much in terms of space, but maybe painters are sort of brought up that way. I was, but when I move the register to temporality, it opens up so much, and the edge goes to really strange places. It becomes inside of it. And then also the question always of where to end the piece, right? That kind of decision, that kind of edge making. So it's not really an answer, Charles, but
it makes me think of from the viewer side, when to walk away, you know, or, you know, how you know that you've had enough of your experience of this thing, whether it's a room that's set up as an installation and you're encouraged to kind of navigate your way around it, or if it's a painting. And I think, you know, as a viewer, that's, I mean, as an art critic, I've made that a practice of my life to, you know, to give considerable attention and sincere time to works of art. And how, you know, how do I know when I have approached a meaningful conclusion to that experience? Where is that edge? And I often find myself circumnavigating an object, looking at it from this side and that side, and trying to find observations that will give me some ticklish delight, or some, you know, some question that's worth holding in my mind for, you know, longer than it takes to eat a meal. So, you know, I'm really kind of taken by these ideas, and it gives me an opportunity. I want to move from that to a quote that I think relates from Amanda's piece, also talking about edges and this idea of time and the viewer's relationship to the object under their consideration. And this is what Amanda wrote. Edges are built to confront the moment when yearning for the object ends, knowing it is inevitable, preparing them for the temporal moment we leave them. So, you know, one of the things that really fascinated me about that quote from Amanda was this idea that that the edges have something to do with desire. And I want to go back to Amanda and just hear her riff on this idea of how edges relate to desire.
All right. Well, Lewis, the desire images start at like 38, so near the very end. So yeah, with Elijah Clark. So I actually started thinking about desire with the edges in a really focused way, starting with Elijah Clark, but then also in like kind of a more abstracted way. And the abstracted way was I wanted to think about the practical edge. So how do paintings get built and how do we look at them? But then also I wanted to think about the edges as what the great art historian Hubert Damisch would call theoretical objects. He defined those as objects that compel theory. And so, of course, he's talking about painting, right? And he's talking about the faces of painting. And of course, painting does compel theory. It's one of the most mysterious philosophical things that we make as human beings. So the question for me was, how can I approach the edge of the canvas as a theoretical object, not just the face? And so one of the ways that I started to think about these objects as theoretical objects is, why do I love looking at the edges? And why do I love looking at painting? And, you know, that's something, again, too, that for art historians, you're not allowed to say that, right? Like, you know, like, why should you have this job? I just love painting, you know? But I think that, you know, what would be the point of writing a whole book about a painting if you didn't love painting, right? So then more practically, I started looking at Elijah Clark, and particularly the image that's on the screen. This is Breaking the Frame. And this is an early one of her pieces. It's oil and wood on canvas. And it looks really, really flat from a distance, but in fact, it's actually pieced together. And so it's different objects essentially put together to make this single image. One of the things that Clark was really interested in is, if you see in the center, the idea of putting two objects of the same color next to each other and seeing that space in between them start to vibrate. She called it the organic line. And so this is a lot of what her early work starts to explore, is this idea of how something that is still can actually start to create movement. And once it starts to create movement, of course, then you wind up getting drawn into it. And so you wind up leaning forward and stuff. And so you're actually then participating in this desiring of the object. The curator and art historian, Luis Perez Aramas, compares this to Duchamp's idea of the infrathin, which Duchamp talks about in terms of like, when you can smell the tobacco in the smoke that comes out of a smoker's breath, that's the infrathin. Or when you sit down on the subway and your butt can still feel the warmth of the person before you on the seat, that's the infrathin, right? It's this moment that's repulsive, but also it's a moment of eros. It's a moment of the erotic, because of course, you know, those are erogenous zones. And so what I started to think about then was how Leisha Clark's spaces and this moment of the organic line can actually start to cause us to want to probe it with all of the implications that that means. So Lewis, if you move to the next image, this, for example, is Jasper Johns painting with two balls. I've not gone back to the literature. This is quite early. This is 1960. Okay, so I don't know how people talked about this in the period, but very clearly this is a sexual work, right? And part of it is because it has two balls, but also because these balls are actually prying open the edges of the canvas. And so what that's allowing you to do with a Johns work, which is so unusual because quite often we see them framed, is you then can peer in and you can actually start to understand process and start to understand the secret parts of a Jasper Johns and what he wants to hide from us. All of the things that are, you know, private and particular to him, but that then we want to know about. And I think then too, one of the things that's interesting about the edges is that it allows us to look at paintings awry. So often when we speak as art historians or write as art historians about painting, we're talking about looking at it what we call en face, face to face. And that's important, again, for the illusion of the painting. The face to face look is a look of requited love. That is a look of equals. Weird to talk about in a Zoom moment, but Charlie, you're a great boss. The look awry is a look of desire. That is a look then that constantly allows for flirtation. It allows for desire and possible acceptance or rejection. And there are actually Greek terms that relate to these things. And so I was then really, really interested in this idea that the edges are this moment where we can approach the painting as the lover and are still unsure about whether it's going to accept us or not. And of course, it's never going to accept us, right? It's a painting. But there's a moment then of hope and desire and approach that permits this look awry, and that the look awry then permits.
Squeak, I would love to get you to hear you respond to that as someone who works on these as you go. Do you look awry in your process, or how's that work for you?
I'm going to quick answer that. I've always looked from the side. I'll lean against the wall and look and see if there's any crenellation on this in the painting, you know, that some colors will pop forward, some back, recede and advance because they're hot and cold. But I want to bring up Duchamp again, because this is heresy, I know, but I don't think of Duchamp as a really good painter. In fact, I don't think he could get the eroticism he was after in his painting, and that he knew the guy to beat would be Courbet, because Courbet's painting is so sexy. And years ago, I made a bumper sticker because people at CCAC were being told painting was dead, and, you know, sculpture was the thing that was going to live on forever. So I made this bumper sticker that said, "Those who can do, and those who can't do Duchamp." Because I think, I may reprint it. Because if you look at Duchamp's last piece, Given, you can't, like the thing about, I'm so excited about this, the thing you can't do with that piece, like you can with with sculpture, is you can't bump into it. You always have to look at it on face. And one of the things about sculpture is that it exists in our own physical human space, whereas painting exists really, even though it's on the wall and we can bump into it, sort of, we can't really physically bump into it. We have to absorb it into our whole body and think about it. And that's why I think it's great for talking about and looking at and for theorizing about. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm curious, very curious also to hear Suzanne respond to this, because working on a transparent medium is a completely different experience, of course, than working on canvas. So Suzanne, you noted how your work is also very process oriented. Can you talk about how edges and desire come together in the process of your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I also look awry. I mean, I'm very interested from that oblique viewpoint, and I'm often more interested, maybe as another analogy back to the book and the pages. I mean, you know, the spine and then the other part, whatever that's called. I mean, reading it that way. So I will have works perpendicular to the wall, or, you know, I've mentioned that I paint on both sides, so it's recto verso.
Louis, can you spin through some of Suzanne's images while she's talking about them? Thank you. But
there's also this relationship beyond the physical edge. So I don't know whether I'm promoting promiscuity here or not, but if we're talking about desire and painting, I'm not, you know, as opposed to my personal life, I mean, professional life, I'm not satisfied with one partner. I don't want to have it limited. I want it to go beyond. And if you can see through, maybe, yeah, I mean, you can see through edges, but maybe the one in the studio where you can see other, I think it's before this, where you can, yeah, right, where you can see through. I mean, there's another one. I mean, the difference between the ones on the wall that are also in a relationship or the ones that are suspended, where if they were lower, I mean, again, this is just a studio shot, but you would look through and you would see other people. And I'm interested in that spatial relationship. So again, it's repeated, whether it's the multiple framing devices of a carpet page, or the rectangles are shaped, they're all irregular rectangles, you know, kind of sagging rectangles in space, and because they're transparent, what is visible through them and what new relationships can be formed. So it's a different view, I think, about desire and painting, and it's the unfixed rather than the fixed, and it's the uncovered rather than the covered, or even, you know, the slightly covered and what's revealed and what's concealed. It's kind of a different take on it.
Louis, can you switch to, can you move to another image so we can see a work proper? Wow, okay, so this is a recto. Can you talk us a little through this one, Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's recto. I don't have the verso, but the verso is, since it's basically transparent, you see a lot of the elements, but the spray will block some of the small add-ons, you know, and again, it's, you know, there's speakers platforms, signage, books, you know, sort of the icon for stop. And again, sound, suppression of sound and issues of, you know, in my mind anyway, issues of censorship. I don't know how much of this comes through, and that's another question, whether or not that's actually important. But it has the vestiges of a sentence diagram. The other work has it more pronounced. The parsing parts of speech, but I've removed the parts of speech, and I've actually kind of removed the sentence diagram. I cut it up and then I resold it, so it's like a scar. On the reverse side, it's even more like a scar. I mean, that's an older one that you can't see.
Louis, is there any way you can zoom in? Is that possible?
I don't know if you can see the stitch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
We've got edges in the composition now.
Right, multiple edges,
Yeah.
and and the stitching and the scarification, and it's more subtle on the other side. And then again, some of this is blocked, so you won't see all the collaged elements, or the drawn elements on there. And since it's recto verso, the edge is, my friend and colleague Joey Tang called it, it's the continuum. The edge is that slash between recto / verso.
I like thinking of it as a continuum, and I love that you brought Joey Tang into the conversation. What a fabulous human being Joey is. As I was looking at these cuts in the composition itself, which I didn't pick up on the first time I was going through it, so I just learned something myself there. It was reminding me a lot of the edges in Laura's work. And Louis, if you don't mind switching back down to Laura's work and kind of zooming in there so we can get a better look. One up, yep, right there maybe. And kind of, coming in. Yeah, Laura, can you talk a little bit about how you think about the relationships of the edges of these components in one of your setups?
Sure, and I love that last part of Amanda's essay, bringing in desire and this whole conversation, and it made me think about why is it I'm so interested in the kind of factuality. You notice there's a chair holding this painting up, right? There's this cardboard folded thing. There's paint cans on the other side holding, and that the edge, to some degree, I guess I would just pose it as a counterpoint, is a place too where we come to recognize the object of the painting, right? The sort of fact of it, how deep it is. It casts a shadow. So for me, I was thinking about this desire thing, and that maybe it really counts on this tension for me between kind of falling out of love. Oh, we're on the floor now, oh, it's just a dumb thing, it's just a piece of fabric. And so you can see the raw edge of the pre-primed canvas behind the stretched canvas is part of the factuality of this space, place, set of interfering items that make up this setup. So I mean, in this particular one, the play is in the corner also, which reminds me of like trying to look awry. It was really hard and purposefully so, but not hopefully irritatingly so. That was not the intention, but to figure out where the center is.
Yeah.
So to ask that question, you're not quite sure whether you look at the right or the left, and it's in the corner also recedes, and so in the corner is a place where two walls form an edge. But so I'm constantly interested in displacing these things on one another, literally on one another, and the kind of factuality of all of it, like bringing this drifty paint and this down to, the wrinkles, down to the factuality.
I really like what you're saying about how you want to create more tension around the quote unquote right angle to look at the object, and how that relates to what Squeak and Suzanne were talking about in looking awry. And something I've experienced as an art viewer over many years is really, where do I really want to be looking here? And when I think about how that relates to this idea of desire that we're talking about, that the object brings out in us, I think it brings in this kind of element of mystique. And I think desire necessarily has to have a bit of mystery in it, or else, I think it's more just like whatever sugar candy is. And when I look at your work here and I think about those terms, it seems to me like you have really gone quite a distance in making that element of desire mystified a bit, and making it a little bit more complex for the viewer to figure out where is that place? And as someone who really is against easy answers, I find that quite compelling, I have to say.
Mhm.
And I also think that there's another part of this, the stitched piece that we were looking at with Suzanne's work. It compels me in the same way, because when I look at something like that, and I try to think about how did she make these choices, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to understand why we have a rhombus here and a triangle there. What I will get as the viewer is the understanding that cuts were made, decisions were made. And in the same way that Amanda was talking about the difference between the beloved and the lover, that distance, I think, is what makes an effective work of art, really, because I think if an effective moment of desire, I think if maybe to go back to the car seat, if you saw the person that got up and then you sat down, it feels different than if you just sit down in the warm seat and you don't know what body was there before yours. So there's like a charge in the unknown. Amanda, would you say that's fair, or would you disagree?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, especially, as an art historian, I have no idea how these things are made. So, so that's perfect. When Squeak and I had our conversation, I told her that I didn't make paintings, and she said, "Well, you must make something." and I told her I make spaghetti, and that's about it. I think that for me, there's something that's always going to be unknown about them. And that actually is important to desire, right? Once you fully possess the thing, the object, or you feel like you might fully possess a human being, that is a difficult situation psychologically that I don't think we want to touch. But once you possess the thing, you stop thinking about it, right? You feel you know it, and so you then stop caring. And I think that one of the ways that the edge works is that they can be knowable, but so often they are not. And so then they do feel enticing in this way, because they permit painting to be withholding. And, painting needs to be withholding, I think, to a certain degree, in order for us to keep coming back to it. Once I think we fully feel like we understand a painting, then it's kind of inert to us. And I agree with Squeak. I think that, this is part of the problem actually with Nude Descending a Staircase, is it's kind of an obvious painting when you look at how it's painted. You're absolutely right. It's not well painted. And I tell my students that, and they're always like, oh, but it's actually really true. And so I think that there is something there that's really important about the unknowability of it. And so, of course, then, Squeak's language that's going on in her paintings, I can't fully know that, right? That's her own secret language to a certain degree. Suzanne's cuts, as you were saying, why are they cut here? Why are they not cut here? There too, I can't possibly know that. With Laura, how to decide to install, how not to install, how to arrange, how to approach. All of this stuff actually, as you were saying, Charlie, it is totally unknowable, and therefore perpetuates desire.
Yes.
This is the thing that's actually really, really important. Anne Carson, the amazing poet, right? She had this beautiful, beautiful quote. The moment of desire is one that defies the proper edge, being a compound of opposites forced together at pressure, right?
I
and
like
so
the pressure.
Yes, exactly. And of course, this is what all of our artists here today are doing. And of course, something too, then the infrathin between us and the painting as well, right? There is that pressure, and that pressure then is different ontologies, different media, right? I am flesh, the painting is not, different modes of existing, an alarm, a guard, whatever it is. There are so many ways that pressure exists. And so it then keeps desire desiring.
I think pressure relates a great deal to attention. As I was thinking about my experience of where I've felt pressure in being around an artwork, and which artworks compel my attention and which artworks I need to consciously reinforce my attention. And it's always the artworks. It's always the artworks that I don't understand, that I have the most questions about. Those are the ones that continuously compel my curiosity. And for me, curiosity is very closely related to desire. There's always a willingness to know. There's a love for a question and kind of a I don't want to say a disappointment in an answer, because every question wants an answer, but to get to the answer, it's sometimes like, I don't know, it's like the end of the book you wish didn't end. It can terminate the desire, and the desire ultimately is what keeps us coming back to the beloved.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think about Eloise and Abelard, and he was her teacher, right? And the reason that she falls so passionately in love with him is because he teaches her things, and she then becomes this exquisitely intelligent, well-informed woman in medieval France, right? And of course, they're then forcibly separated and horrible things happen to them. And she then becomes a huge religious figure, as does he. But her desire for him is never requited, because she desires to know more. She desires to know the knowledge that he can have, because he's a man in medieval France and she is a woman in medieval France. That desire keeps on building for her. It's such a wonderful thing.
It is a wonderful thing. I have another question that I just saw on my note sheet that I would have completely forgotten had I not printed this note sheet out. And I wanna bring it up mostly because we're in a moment of coronavirus. And there's a set of words that you put in your intro, Amanda, that I could not separate from our moment. And maybe you can separate it from our moment, or maybe it just comes out of our moment. But I'm gonna read, am I gonna read something here? Or am I just gonna paraphrase you? I'm not sure if it'll be one or the other. Nope, that's the wrong one. Oh, here it is. In these strategies, we're talking about frames, and this is this is a thing we could or could not go into. Frames, and why do we need them? Where do they come from? Why do we start hiding the edges of paintings in art history to begin? That's not my question. My question is, in thinking about frames, in the strategies of framing objects, brackets around that part, the edge is normalized. Its position as a site of potential infection from and to the outside is reduced and managed. And I'm curious about this phrase of the site of potential infection. It's very captivating to me. Where does that come from?
Well, as you say, in this stage of COVID, if we're all like licking the edges of paintings, we're all in trouble, right? So there's that.
You got licking paintings, Amanda?
Well, first I wanted to say that two of the contributors to the critics page, Amy Ng and Amy Knight Powell, both wrote about the convention of Western painting from a historical perspective. So in terms of framing and not framing things, they're really, really interesting to read about in that respect. In terms of what I was writing about, I think it's true that we can't think about this in terms of the times of COVID, because how can we not, right? And I think what's kind of interesting to think about in the time of COVID is if we're thinking about proper viewing distance, which then would of course lock a viewer into place somewhere, then we would all need to be standing right next to each other in that same place, right? And so it's actually good to look at the edges of paintings right now, because it provides you with the appropriate at least 6 feet distance. So I think that that's actually really, really important. It's for public health. But the other thing, when I was actually writing this, I was really inspired by Michael Camille's book, The Image on the Edge. And this kind of apropos to what Suzanne was talking about is all about marginal images in medieval manuscripts, around the outsides of doorways, around medieval churches. Why are there things that look vulgar or sexual existing on church buildings? That doesn't make sense. And, like, how do they function that way? He talks about them, first of all, in terms of possibly like a release, of course, but also they're apotropaic possibilities.
Yeah.
So perhaps there is a way that a demon figure on a church might actually then protect us because it's warding things off, right? And so the edge winds up actually being something that can work in both directions. And so I saw somebody mention Kant here. We could think about, of course, the Aragon and the Paragon, and the way that they kind of work together to define each other. The edge both defines the inside and defines what's outside of things. And so it can be both protective and also something that could be very infected at the same time. But also they are the points of the paintings that receive the most abuse. And Lewis, if you go up to 33, the star of Frank Stella. So this is a Frank Stella. Stella's resolutely making flat painting, right? What you see is what you see, despite the fact that these are super, super thick stretchers, right? He's taking a stretcher bar and actually turning it so that it's much, much wider than the normal painting is. But once you start to look at the edges of his canvases, you start to see that, first of all, there's strain on the canvas. And so, for example, in the little, like, the crux of the side of this star, you're seeing that the canvas actually had to be sliced because the tension would not work. And it's kind of hard to see in this image, but up at the top, there's actually like tape residue of little like crosses of tape where they'd been on there for so long that they actually stained the canvas. When Squeak and I were talking, I was telling her one Frank Stella I saw actually must have had a coffee cup set on it. And there was like a ring on the edge of the canvas. So, all of this stuff, Stella is so devoted to the idea of the painting being flat and being an image. And of course, when we look at the image on the left-hand side here, that is utterly believable. Yeah. However, the depth of his canvases mean that they actually wind up being infected by objecthood, by the outside world, because they can't help but be, not least because they're not framed. Sometimes they are, but most of the time they're not. Sometimes they have little lathe frames on them. One thing too that's kind of interesting, Mary Douglas wrote in Purity and Danger, she's a person that Michael Camille cites, that there is infection too when statements start to kind of brush up against each other and not quite fit. And there's a moment then of tension there. And there too, we can almost see this then as like a philosophical infection where the notion of the edge might actually risk edging over onto the face of the painting.
Yes.
I think Stella manages to avoid it, but it can happen, in fact.
Yeah, I think it can totally happen. And as you were talking, I was thinking about infection as like a threshold type idea too. The moment of something passing from one body to another body, be that first body a canvas and that second body a viewer. Perhaps that moment of infection is when the moment of desire is undeniable.
Yeah.
And you cannot perhaps say why you're so compelled by this object, but you also cannot deny that this object is compelling you. I don't know, as a maker, Squeak or Suzanne or Laura, can you speak to this moment of infection as something between the object passing to you and you to it?
I can do it as a viewer, as a beholder, but The making part is kind of like receiving radio waves to me. So it's that kind of, there's that threshold doesn't exist in making, but I have had experiences where I've been brought to my knees, really, like I want to like fall down on the floor.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no words for that. And that's a great thing about painting is you can't contain it. It's so broad, it ripples out like a pebble in a pond.
I guess I see it more as, as the painting being the prophylactic device. I don't see it as, as something that's disease-ridden. I see it for me as the maker as something that restores my health. And I think it's this relationship again with the, like the paint, like the edge being the line between the paint, the paint being the line to the outside world, or between the work, or between me and the outside world. So I think the making process is actually a way to, find solace, but also place myself in relation to the world and what's going on around me. And I mentioned in my essay that I was first asked to write about edges after 9/11. So it's sort of after, in relation to something that's disastrous or harmful to us. But conversely, I think I find health through the making of these works.
And I would just say that I'm probably quite suspicious of when something takes hold of me. So,
Interesting.
So the edge for me really is a way, again, quite a dumb way, right? To remind, to jump out of that beholding, right? That being beheld. Yeah. And because it's somehow, real. But I find that is the way I try to be in the world too. That is to be always quite aware of how I am knowing something or being asked to know something. So the criticality that I want to bring into the work, right? Where we might have this drift, but we also have a can, or we have an edge that is very prominent, that is, not, it doesn't seem to be a part of the, let's say the whole, right? It's broken. It makes me, I like to hope that it makes me keep asking the question, right? Yeah. And that's not to say I'm not also brought to my knees by things. I love that. But another side of me always is quite curious. How is that operating? How is that operating on me? Right. And, in a social way, how does that operate on our society if we don't sort of find the edges, right? And recognize the construction of what we're knowing, right?
Recognize the construction. Boy, oh boy, are we in a moment of construction recognition right now.
Put on the mask.
Yeah, right. Well, I feel so touched to have been in dialogue with you all for a full 60 minutes. And I want to take an edge, turn the corner, and provide an opportunity for some of our audience members to engage with you as well. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Anya, who will lead the question and answer portion of our broadcast today.
I'm really excited to get into this. We have so many amazing questions coming through. And the first, I'm gonna turn to Ken Nuremberg. And I think this is a pretty relevant question for the format that we're in, a question about virtual space. So Ken, let me find you, excuse me, to let you unmute. There you are.
All right, you guys hear me okay? Man, I always end up going first during these Q&A things. It scares me. So yeah, I'm thinking, especially since we're doing this whole thing virtually over Zoom right now and doing everything virtually, it kind of, virtual space kind of is hard not to think about. So I'm thinking about, what about the edge in virtual spaces, such as in video, VR, or augmented reality kind of setups where we're looking at things with our phone and there's, virtual objects that are interacting with the real world. These spaces can be infinite, and the audience can sometimes observe and move through them similarly to how they view a real space. But there's still an apparatus involved. So that could be a VR headset, a projection, or a screen, a video game controller. And I'm kind of wondering how, you know, an apparatus like that can relate to the apparatus of the canvas, or, you know, the frame, the stretcher, edge of paper. And then time also becomes involved in that, and where and how the edge is presenting itself. And no, I also mentioned the cyclorama being another thing where the edge is weird, because there's, you know, on one axis it's infinite, and 360, whereas on, you know, there are two edges on the top and bottom. Yeah, I admit that's a lot to dig into, but if there's any thoughts coming out of that, I'd love to hear it.
May I start the reply? Actually, two of my works kind of, I don't know if we can go back to the projections or not, but take this maybe not directly, because I'm sort of the worst person to ask about virtual, you know, digital means, being as low tech and analog as I am. But during the pandemic, I've continued to use vinyl, but I've switched to projections of light coming through little pieces of vinyl. So there might be perforations in there or cut marks. And then the light and paint or ink, and then the light goes through and it projects the image, and it's out of on the natural light, the sunlight, the degree of light cast, the edge will dissolve. Yeah, this is a good example. So the vinyl is the one on the, you know, on the, looks like on a shelf, and then the projected image from the vinyl is what you see frontally. So, and it can, and the upper register, it shows the dissolve. I mean, it's cut off by the slide, but the dissolve will go, it will fade away, or if the sun starts to go down, it just disappears, or the whole thing disappears. So this is my way of kind of extend, I don't know if it's extending the edge, but seeing the edge in a new way that's more akin to projection and light. And I'm not sure which the piece is. Is it the little strip of vinyl, or is it the ephemeral projection on the wall, which inevitably will disappear? So, or is it both? So that's my way of thinking about it. But again, I need someone who's more savvy in tech matter to answer this more fully.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting to me, because I think we're also, you know, anytime we're interacting with looking, we're always acting with the projection. We're always dealing with the projection of light, basically, because that's how, you know, that's the apparatus of our eyes, how that works too. So it can kind of all break down into one thing that way, but that might be another topic though.
I also should say that the text for that is by Luke Stettner. It's not original.
I think your question already is such an important one, right? That is to ask about edges in these new spaces, right? I mean, that sounds maybe very simple, but I am very attentive at the moment to looking for those sorts of things in immersive environments. So I just admitted that I'm a suspicious viewer or something, right? Like I'm interested in where I'm brought out of, right? Distanced from, cut, right? Out of or into, and maybe the apparatus is revealed, maybe time is doing that cutting, right? So I'm really fascinated right now, and quite, you know, especially in the way at least days blur, Zoom days blur, time has become, I don't know how to describe it, my experience of it. So I just love that you're asking that question, because that to me is what's on my mind as I'm experiencing and kind of looking for my point of interest into these new forms. So I can't really answer it except to say, around the question of edge seems to me to be a place where, you know, something about what we are experiencing we'll know something more about it. And whether it's a temporal edge or a spatial one.
So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you both. And I'm just also, I want to say to Laura and Suzanne, it's really good to see you guys again.
Nice to see
It's
you.
good to see you again.
Thank you, Ken. Our next question comes from Zeb. If Zeb, you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you for this enlightening conversation. My question is, I'm interested in how each artist thinks about the notion of the continuum between factuality and desire as a theoretical basis in their practice, and how desire may demonstrate passion and how the factual can demonstrate rational thought or disinterest, and how they deal with these two notions in their practice, which I think is really important. Thank you.
You've stumped us.
I love the question, of course, the factual and desire. And, you know, I keep thinking about truth and beauty also and Amanda can jump in, I'm not the philosopher here, but it's always fascinated me as a problematic, right? And maybe especially now. So I think it's the relation between these two things for me that have to be at play. So whether we call the factual the actual measurable edge of the painting, something like that, although I would, I can't make a piece that doesn't isn't cut through by something that I would call factual, right? That I would say I experience as factual. Then we ask a question about who's how one is experiencing fact. So it's not simply, they're not simple categories, but I love the question, and I think the tension is actually central to how what I make and how I ask to know about what I'm making.
I don't know if this answers it or not, but you know how snails, when you watch them, they leave a trail that sort of disappears. It's clear. But to me, that's like an actual thing, a physical reality. And so for me, the painting things is like the snail trail. It's like a physical manifestation of either thinking or touching or even smelling. And it's just a carrier for all that stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. Those were great responses.
Yeah, those are amazing responses and a beautifully formulated question. Thank you. And so our next question comes from Lauren, and I'll go to you. Lauren Amirti.
Hello.
Yeah.
All right, so getting my question as reference. Hi to everybody, and thank you so much for this. I'm wondering how, of course, you've been making your work longer than our current condition, but we are in this world of binaries and people wanting easy answers. And I wonder how you see your practices as political acts, or maybe, something that kind of fights with those issues that we're dealing with today.
Well, since they don't, I look at it through the lens of what we have in this administration. And since since even the main guy does not have real art in his space, he likes fakes. I think it is a political act to actually make something that one feels is truthful and that they can believe in, and that they are not lying in. It's the lies really get me. I lost what else I would say, but anyhow, maybe somebody else will jump in. It's so aggravating.
I don't know, I might say that before this, I was making making protest signs, but without any words. So it, the format before any of this. So it became in a certain way an art object, or when I use sentence diagrams. I mean, I may be parsing the sentence, and one of them was, what does it mean to stay silent in the face of oppression? But there means for me to kind of examine and to have others examine, what does that mean, or what's, you know, what does it mean to be using it in an artwork, as opposed to being out on the street, or should you be out on the street, or can you be a political artist and be an activist and not have it, the politics play any part in your own art? You know, so these are just kind of thought bubbles that I kind of insert into the work, since a lot of it is text oriented. I, you know, obviously don't have any solutions, but just in terms of what's shifted during the pandemic, again, my way of making has changed to, you know, smaller environment, smaller scale, and using light, but still using words and projections of words that try to figure out the situation, kind of try to deconstruct what's going on, but by constructing new work.
The other thing about words is that it slows down the viewer, beholder. So they have to switch languages kind of from just visual to something cognitive. And if you really slow it down, they have to put E, Y, E, S, and then flip back and go, what is that? Eyes. And then what is that? Is it something on my face? Is it something on the ground? You know, it's like, so the language in work, I think, makes the viewer have to contemplate more, and not in a literal way, but in a more poetic way.
Yeah, I would add on to that as someone who spends a lot of time on the receiving end of artworks, that in a politically charged moment, it's hard for me to disengage from the emotions that are triggered by those political actions that resonate in my mind and have an effect on my body, and that I can't sincerely compartmentalize. And so when I come into contact with something that triggers emotions that connect to some of those, maybe it's uncertainty, maybe it's for example, in Suzanne's work, seeing the cuts in those pieces and where they're welded together, and what that bind means, what it, you know, to join two disjointed pieces on an edge that is clearly not meant to hide itself. You know, these types of things, for me, they can take on a political element, whether or not the artist has intended that. And I think that's one of the things that is really imperative for artists of deep sincerity, and that I think are the types of artists who are important to younger artists, are those whose practice maintains a kind of vital connection to this rootedness in being, and whether or not it's a politically hot moment, the elements that are retained in the decisions that were made, they resonate on different frequencies depending on the moment that we're in. So I feel like for the last 4 years, I couldn't look at work without having these types of thoughts. Where in, you know, the 8 years of Obama, I didn't protest once, you know, and I really thought a lot more about beauty. So I feel answering as a viewer and a receiver and not a maker. That's how I feel about the political nature of artwork. Full stop.
One of the things too that I just want to say that attracted me to doing this critics page about the edge is one of the areas of them being theoretical objects is whether or not the edge can be political. And I think that is an opportunity. George Rush wrote for this one and wrote actually about the way that students kind of grapple with the edges. And it was an interestingly Marxist take. But then also Cesar Paternoster wrote a very brief, like amazing summa of basically his entire career in like 500 words. he focuses on painting on the edge and vacates then the center of the canvas as a way, as an Argentinian artist, to contradict or to encounter the Western insistence that the center of the painting is the thing that's important. And so, you know, Paternoster's text and then his work as well as his books have been entirely about this possibility that abstraction actually can be something that is a site of resistance, and that it's in the refusal to make a Western painting that he then can make something else. And you know, his big reference point for this is Torres Garcia's upside down map of South America, which has been shown at MoMA and things like that. It's easily Googleable, where the entire idea that the South is North, and so everything then is upended. But then you can see this as well in Lygia Clark, in Helio Oiticica, in Velista Castro, in Adriana Barajau. You know, a lot of these Latin American artists are also looking at the edge and are doing so in this political way, which is really, really interesting. And so you can have a theoretical object that does different things. Desire is what I chose to write about, but Cesar wrote about it in terms of the politics.
Thank you for those thoughts. And I feel like this conversation around the politics of edges goes so cleanly into our next question, which is from our very own Henry at the Rail, thinking about the politics of access. So if you want to take it away.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone involved in this conversation. Yeah, I would love to follow up on Amanda, that you mentioned the kind of the Marxist account that we have in the October issue in the Critics Page of Edges. And I was thinking about, someone in the chat mentioned borderlands. And so my mind went to Carl Jung's Magic Circle as a place in like kind of early civilizations where ritual takes place. And then also Camille Paglia mentions the Temenos, which is an area of land which is sectioned off for sacred ritual or like royal ritual. And so I'm thinking about like the deeper politics of like why an edge is so satisfying to our culture, and like what it has to do with a refusal of access, like forbidding entry, and how like the architectures that, you know, are the most sacred, like precincts and apses, and then also the parapet of like the Renaissance painting is something which kind of forbids, it is defensive and it forbids entry. And so what does this have to say about our culture that's like, you know, an art history of capital or acquisition? And then maybe even a bigger question about erotics and like why like refusal or denial of access is such an intriguing thing for us.
Well, I actually think that your question wound up being more provocative as a rhetorical question, rather than one that I can actually answer. Not because I'm lazy, although I'm going to use that anyway, but rather because I actually think that you're making an observation about today's culture, such as we understand it, but also about today's art world, right? And I think that what George Rush was writing about actually was this moment of realizing, his question in his essay is, why do my students all paint the edges of their canvases black? Why do they do that? I don't understand. And I remember him talking about this in a review once. And so that was my question to him too, was why do they do this? And he came to the realization that they don't have the time. They may not have the money. They don't necessarily have the knowledge. and they have the desire to make art. However, they are caught up in today's art world and also caught up in today's university world, which are both constant drains on their own capital. Whether it's their finances, whether it's their passions, whether it's their eyesight, because they're learning over Zoom constantly, and they're all going to need glasses before they graduate and all of this stuff, right? And so one of the things that he proposes is that they paint the edges of their canvases to refute the pre-made canvas, that it is a Marxist moment, even if they don't realize that it is such. And I really love that idea. Because what it does is it permits for this no place, this non-site, right? That then isn't about capital and isn't about them and isn't about desire. And it winds up actually kind of recentering them in this really kind of spectacular and profound way. That frankly, I don't know that an undergraduate can articulate. Maybe they can, I'm not sure. I know that doesn't answer your question, but I think that there is something in the moment right now about a desire to remove oneself, but also to be present, which I guess kind of goes back to Ken's question as well, right? How do you live off the grid and yet be an Instagram influencer? Right. And so I think that these non-sites, these no places, like the edge, like the outskirts of town, like the spaces behind a billboard, like the parapet in a painting, they wind up being places where one can be outside and inside simultaneously.
I might add just a little footnote to that. I mean, another entryway into these non-sites or non-places, but also with humor, as George's, there was humor in George's response as well, is the Kingdom of Elgaland and Vargaland, that artist collective that deals with liminal spaces and disputed territories. Also the Inframance, the ultra thin of Duchamp, where territories that don't really exist on the map, or it's on the border of the map, and they're contested. And there is an artist collective who plays with this, and the hypnagogic state as well. I think Ken had something about that. So it's another way to deal with the spaces in between, liminality and where the edge might possibly be. There it is. Thank you.
Yeah, I dropped the link in the chat if anyone wants to check out Vargaland. Thank you for that question, observation, and the beautiful responses. Our next question comes from another rail comrade, Mavika, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Comrade Anya. And thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. This has been incredible. I was a huge fan of this critics page, and this has just been like a mind-blowing panel. So thank you so much. I have a question. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about kind of God. I feel like, Amanda, listening to you speak about viewership and sort of sight and the sideways view, where you sort of described it very beautifully as the face-to-face view being the look of requited love, or the look of equals, but the looking awry or the looking askew being sort of the look of the unrequited, or of desire, of a kind of question that exists in like an atmosphere of a kind of uncertainty or ambivalence. And sort of this metaphor of like the lover and the beloved reminds me so much of how sort of, one thinks about God and transcendence kind of outside of like a Western context. So even on the level of like, I'm sort of thinking Islamic mysticism, but I'm thinking a bunch of other things, how we might think about sight and puncture, and then viewing, your beloved and puncture, and then encountering God and puncture, and how these are really supposed to be like all the same gesture when you peel them back. And I don't know, this is also reminding me kind of the idea of burying the lead, the sleight of hand of sort of obscuring the beloved on the margins, but that marginal place being the place where like all meaning is created anyway. So I feel like this has been having a lot of resonances for me. And I was wondering if sort of amongst the four of you, if you came across any thinking about faith or religiosity and sort of the viewership of the margins, you know, if you came across anything like that or like systems like that while thinking about edges.
I can reply, but it's a secular take on this, just in terms of margins and structure, because other than the carpet pages and illuminated manuscripts, I'm also influenced by the construction of a page of Talmud, the compilation of Jewish law and lore. And I don't know, I know virtually nothing about the content, but it's the structure of central, a body of text and then commentaries around it. And then there's a commentary on the commentary or a digression or emendation. And it keeps going around the page with different responses. It's like a call and response. So structurally, although there's religion involved, I mean, I'm interested in the secular visual structure of that. So going, you know, and that's where the edge comes in for me.
I think
I
I
have
just,
to admit,
oops, sorry.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Laura.
No, just really quickly, because it's such a great question and I'm going to be very general, but I find myself really interested in questions of presence, you know, and the flip side absence. So I don't know exactly how that lines up. I'm, you know, especially with, as you bring up puncture as a kind of counterpoint to something, let's say, spiritual or beyond, right? That factuality of puncture. So I'm fascinated by the Danase painters and Korean group and some of the sort of ways in which I think questions of presence are at play there in the markings of canvas. But I'm going to leave it there. Nothing more specific than that, but thank you for that question.
And I guess I would just have to say, I have to admit, I don't think about God when I think about painting very often. Although one time that I did think about God was my husband wrote a book about Raphael, and one of the questions he asked in the Raphael book was, what does God see? So when you're looking at a Raphael painting of Christ, what then, if we put ourselves in the mindset of Christ, does he see looking out? That's always been kind of mind-blowing to me a little bit. But speaking about abstraction, which is what I tend to write about in terms of painting, your idea of the puncture, of course, reminds me of the punctum, right? And so then I would think too about what part of the painting wounds me, and where then does that take me? What moment of knowledge or of becoming knowledge does that take me to? And so I would be curious about that, and whether someone might think of that then in terms of faith or God or the attempt maybe to be better.
I would add one small thought onto that, this idea of puncture that makes me think of the moment when two things intersect and cross the threshold of another. And I think, to me, that connects to the idea of infection that we were talking about, and I as a photography person, I can't not hear Roland Barthes in the back of my head talking about the punctum of an image. And when I think about how the experience of puncture, and wound, and attention, and beauty, pain, and really the moment, the phenomenon, when I experience that, when something from the artwork has crossed deeply into my being, I I don't connect it to a moment of religiosity, but I do connect it to a moment of something that is happening that's I'm only part of it. I don't, I feel like it's me and the object, and then the confluence of those two things enables a phenomenon like you're describing. And I regret that it doesn't happen with every work of art.
I feel like we're sort of talking about the invisible in a way. And I think that one of the great things that art does is reveal the invisible and then reveals the present sort of simultaneously. And so I like that question. I'm more secular. I'm not sure there's a God, but maybe there is, so, but it resides in that place, in that, there's a word for this, the in-between thing. And
well, it's the liminal,
Liminal.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really important. I think that I wonder, now this is going to sidetrack, but the fact that we can take pictures of things and we have them on our phones and stuff, does that make them less desirable and more possessible? Because I think one of the hallmarks of art for me is that it really can't be possessed. It's only lent or borrowed. It's available at the same time. That's all I have to say about that.
Anya, can I jump in with something? Is that okay if I go rogue here? I feel like, I like that we started off with this idea of secular, but I feel like I almost meant sort of God and religion, not in a Bible thumping way, but in a way, like if you grow up in a system of metaphors that, you can't not think of sight and not think of God because there is a system of metaphors that is built that way. Mm-hmm. So, but I feel like Squeak, what you just articulated really resonates with me about sort of rendering the invisible.
And that's how I interpreted what you said. So yeah. Great. That was a great question.
It's a great answer.
Thank you.
It's almost hard to know where to go from there. It's like, wow. Exactly. So thank you for bringing us there, Malvika. We have a question from Sergio, who can't read himself, so I'll read it for him. So he's thinking about the edge in photography. And when we look at a photograph, are we looking at that landscape, at that subject, or is it secondary? He's saying he thinks what's in the photograph is secondary, and what we're really looking at is the framing, the edge. So then it becomes like borrowing a gaze. And he's just asking for thoughts on the idea of the borrowed gaze.
I think I'll just blurt this out. I think of photography as a capturing device. It captures what the camera sees and what the photographer is pointing it at and wants to gather. And I don't know if it's different for me because it calls memory up really quickly. So then that puts you back in your body and then brings you back into the present at the same time while you're looking at something that most photography it has something recognizable, familiar, either on like an unconscious level or directly. And that familiarity places us in our bodies instantly. I don't know. There we go.
Charlie, do you want to hop in as the photo person?
I think that Squeak put it very perfectly. I always think of photography as a subtractive medium, and the edge of the photograph is very captivating to me because it signals the edge of the photographer's decision. And I happen to live with a photographer, and I happen to grow up with this human in the age of analog photography when there were contact sheets. And the ability to look at a photographer's contact sheet and often to see like the edges of a painting, the other ideas or avenues that were potentially proposed for that moment of vision it comes down to a number of decisions. And when I think about it like that, I really think about it in the same way that I thought about how we were talking about Suzanne's work or Laura's work in trying to navigate your way through the decisions that the person had made. And ultimately, you know, the merit of those decisions is how captivating they are in holding the viewer's attention. The more thoughtful, cunning, clever, creative, the more they will be effective. The more under-considered, the quicker we will pass through them.
Thank you. We have another question from our very own Malvika. If you'd like to speak again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but yeah.
Okay, so this is sort of a collaborative question with Ken. But in the chat, Ken, you wrote sort of famously, this has me thinking of Tolstoy's theory of art being something that infects the viewer, and then that viewer being able to spread that infection. And sort of behind the scenes in the team Slack, we were all going crazy over this comment, really loving it, because we were thinking about sort of how, at least I personally saw the October Critics Page as sort of tracing a history of ideas about visual culture and margins. And we were wondering if you could kind of talk us through different theories of art and different ways of contextualizing sort of spread or community spread. I don't know, what one thought that we were thinking is sort of like the idea behind sight and viewership has a kind of transference in it, maybe, that in seeing something, in beholding it, you have replicated it within yourself and then introduced it into your body. I feel like Charlie has been talking about this a bit as well, but we were really curious sort of, you know, about sort of Tolstoy's like theory of art as a jumping off point for other theories about infection in sight.
I'm gonna hand it to Laura because she looks like she is itching to answer.
Oh, Amanda, I thought you were going to save me. I'm intrigued, so I'm kind of like leaning in, but you know, it's just too simplifying to say this, but you know what, I just feel the terrifying fact of now is this edgelessness, right? This spread that is. And so where is the containment, right? Where, so as I conceptualize, visualize, sort of experience, you know, even let's say the nomenclature around bubbles that are coming up, how everyone's creating bubbles, or I've been thinking a lot about these kind of graphics of breath that have been out there as we try to make safe spaces. It's odd, but you probably can see, again, very simplistically, I atomize stuff, right? I atomize pigment and it hits stuff. And I'm, you know, I keep thinking about, so what's hitting this? How are we erecting? What are we erecting? How are we protecting? Who are we forgetting? What is, you know, what is not, where are we so woefully short of thinking about all that has fallen in between? What is being revealed? So that is my very simplistic, non-theoretical take.
I can't add to that. You know, that really encapsulates it, talking about containment, but I did want to mention that I had been thinking about Laura's spray work because of the particles and that they're airborne and how salutary in nature they are and how wonderful in terms of painting. But then I think of those other qualities, you know, airborne particles and you know, and the disease they bring, the virus they bring, and what an opposition, what a contrast that is.
I think too, I mean, meme has become such a meme itself, but the meme actually is something, right? It's a contagious thought when it was first theorized. And so it's a thought that you might be thinking and then somehow somebody else thinks. And there's an entire science actually about this, about how does that thought somehow get from your brain to somebody else's brain. Now it's about like kittens and stuff like that. But before it was about kittens, it was about this. The other model of the meme too is a germ, right? That somehow it infects you in this really fascinating way. So how is it that, you know, in Unzipped, Isaac Mizrahi decides to do Nanook of the North for his collection, but then Chanel also does Nanook of the North, you know, like, how is that possible? It's a meme at that point, right? In whatever, 1993, 94. So there's kind of an interesting model to think about, meme prior to kittens. But then I also think about like the idea of the edge of the world, and the way that Lucretius thinks about the edge of the world, right? That the archer, the javelin thrower runs right up to the edge of the world, and then he throws the javelin and the javelin goes. And so then the edge of the world can't possibly be the edge of the world, right? There has to be something more beyond the edge of the world. And so I think that, I mean, here I am, a lover of painting, right? When we think about the really good art that we look at and we start to think about the way that it works on us, maybe it's that it takes us right up to the edge, and then there's more. And then there's more, and then there's more. And when we talk to Malvika, there's more, you know? I think that this model actually could really work for a model of painting. And of course, I think painting would totally agree.
I love that, Amanda. Thank you. Our very last question will be from Fong Bui, the publisher of the Brooklyn Rail. You'd like to unmute.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Squeak, Laura, Suzanne, and Amanda, and Charlie. It turned out to be quite a luminous gathering. It's exciting. I can't even do anything. I was supposed to be doing some work, but then I listened the whole time, and it's very hard to take all in without doing any justice of being incisive and being affected by what's being, you know, expressed and shared. So I took few words, notes while I'm working. Squid mentioned Trump and fake, the idea of fake art or fake anything of the sort. And then there's ritual, there's God, there's desire, there's puncture, there are edges versus center. And so I just want to go to one by one slowly, but then hopefully integrate it all. When the notion of fake came about, I think it's interesting. We are reminded to go back to Amanda, Giovanni Morelli. You know, when Morellian technique that was invented, his identification really came from medical practice, where if you have an ailment somewhere specifically, let's say your shoulder blade, it must affect the way that your hand is moving, you know, or somewhere else besides that very area. So that's when the edges of things began to be looked at more carefully. So Morelli sort of brought that into his own idea of connoisseurship, detecting what is being real and fake. Because we know that in history, in art history, there's always a master that trying to recreate a style for his disciples, you know, that reinsuring there is a livelihood ahead. So you take, for example, Raphael, who have studied with Perugino. There are many other people along Raphael in that workshop. Mm-hmm. So how do you identify? We knowing that the master never really, no need to have authorship. There's no signature needed. It's all on paper and whatnot. So there's a lot of fake. And then when Morelli technique was invented, you began to look at the margins, like the ears, or the way the hand is, you know, the finger is painted and whatnot. You detect the speed. of the head, the brush, the movement of the hand in order to identify. Similarly, that we know the expert of those who can tell fake signature and real signature, not that dissimilar. But so I thought of the idea of fake versus make and versus fact. So it's really interesting, fake, make, fact. So when you think about the word made, it means to give being to give form, to bring something into existence concretely, to construct something. Whereas fact is a product of labor, things made by hand. So it's connected with fact, make. It's so interesting that the Trump administration understood that, maybe not consciously, but when Conway came up with the idea alternative fact, that was super clever. Do you know what I mean? So I thought of it, and I bring it back to the notion of God too. God is closer to those who are struggling. I remember having, like, one of the thrill in life is really spending an evening with Jean-Louis Berraud. You guys remember him at all? The great actor in Children of Paradise, L'Enfant de Paradis, made during the war and then screened it in the tail end of the Second World War. And the reason why it's called the Children of Paradise, because when the mime theater is being performed, as you remember, the people who can pay, the most expensive seat get to sit near where the spectacle, the happening is happening. The play is unfolding, where the poorest sit in the highest place and they can't see anything. That's like going to a baseball, or a similar spectacle of sport. You sit in the highest place, the seat, and that's what called Children of Paradise. They sit near the God, and they have nothing to hide when their emotion is being received. They love it, they applaud. If they don't love it, they boo. So that was always a very interesting thing that go back and forth. But in terms of, I'm thinking about edges and center. It's so interesting, Amanda, talk about that. Where we are now, we have so much time to contemplate, to think through things. And the slowness of pandemic, of the COVID-19 have put that in real practice for all of us. For some artists we know, some poets, some writer decided not to work at all. And others really dive into it, working productively. So it's interesting, both of it, both sides of choices of selection of doing. But I think what we learn, especially from my perspective from the rail, all of us beginning to think that we have lived in the last 2 decades or so, if not more, where everyone is rushing to the center. Everyone is so eager to be acknowledged, to be applauded, to be visible in the center, whereas the edges of things have been completely abandoned, not even cultivated. The whole idea of bohemian life has been ended since the war in Vietnam in 1975. All the great leftist progressive thinker and intellectual moved to the academy, and the next 2 generations or 3, they got stuck there because they found that was the way to make a living. So they don't live in the counterculture and the edges whatsoever. And that's where we are being, thinking, retooling our processes and our way of mobilized thinking into concrete sort of tangibility, where one foot gotta be in the edges, while the other foot can be in the center. And I think that you can't afford to do both. But if you do both, you have to do both very well. So that's why it's so interesting what we're going to do now, going through. That's why the role of the artist is so essential. The idea of thinking without the banister, and you walk down, up the stair, and down without having the need to rest your hand on the handrail. So I think this is where we are. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fong, for those observations. And this has been such a wonderful conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunchtime conversations with a poem pre-pandemic, in person, reading poetry together. And we've carried that into these community events. And I'm thrilled to welcome today's Poet Laureate, Steve Benson, to the stage. Steve Benson mixes media and works in poetry readings. He lives in Maine and is an active member of Midcoast Maine Extinction Rebellion, the Climate Psychology Alliance, and USA-Palestine Mental Health Network, among others. What this is forthcoming from Chax Press. So, Steve, I'm gonna hand the mic over to you. There you go.
Running so fast, running so fast, right hell for leather towards the edge, towards the beginning of mortality, right over the line, can happen before you know it, fall into darkness. However it's done, it might be done by surprise or in an implicit, impossible way. I'm common sense. We are not having any authority for what we are saying. This is not a send up of that. This is no correct reply. There is no edge beyond the beginning. There's segues, there's constant shifting between the context and the matter itself that is very noisy. And inside here, where everything runs together and challenges its own limits, its own ways of being, its own progress and process. No end, no delight, no sphere of influence, no rampaging rhinoceroses or closed quarters. Screen share can be music, or it can be a computer sound. It might send material over to slide into surprises that aren't really visible, can't be known exactly, like a melting permafrost. And methane expands as crystalline gaseous material. That may be why the huge cavities in the earth suddenly appear and seem to take over the horizon. So that no matter how fast the running takes place, it's simply a matter of looking forward as a political discourse. After all is said and done, after all, a phrase, a word, a position that is itself a segue, obviously, that to feel and witness such trauma, pain, torture, agony. I live longer, I witness more. It's constantly burning around the edge of consciousness, awareness of what's happening elsewhere, everywhere in the world. My burdens are so minimal that I am aware of connections. The more that things are falling apart in my mind, as well as everywhere else that I look, and yet the earth is solid. My feet are limited by the ground that they rest on, and that I can press against by standing up, by letting myself go, letting myself run across that field towards the ocean, and see where the end lies. It's to see this interbeing of everything being one same thing. I'm thinking we're all feet on the ground, the wooden floor happening at the same time. And we may die at any moment. Everyone may die at any moment. If we remember this, we are the resistance, living, going on, being, demanding life for all life that we identify with, recognize as self, as the center of being how we are. And so I could imagine, I was imagining speaking and let it rip through and across, rip the sides and the center out, and agree to disagree, everything up in the air. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you so
And
much, Steve.
so wonderful talking.
So, yeah, this has been a wonderful talk, and I feel like that performance perfectly encapsulated for me, what Amanda was talking about, the edge that is not an edge. And so what a wonderful way to end. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Laura, Suzanne, Squeak, Amanda, and Charlie for hosting this conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and you can join us next Monday at 1 p.m. For a conversation between Sanford Biggers and Yassi Alapur. And now you should be able to turn on your microphones. And
thank you so much, everyone.
Goodbye, yeah.
That was incredible.
This is great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thanks, Amanda.
Charlie,
Squeak.
Suzanne.
Great
Brooke,
Steve.
Have a good, safe weekend.
Steve,
Thanks, Steve.
so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
That was a brilliant
Brooklyn Rail. It
conversation.
was really wonderful.
Thank you, Steve Benson.
so much.
Thank you, Steve. Beautiful reading.
Amanda, I'm looking forward to Jackson after this.